we are scientists, and when we want to make a statement about something, we want to measure it first, because we want to know what we're talking about. So the IHS, the International Headache Society, some time ago, they made a special interest group, the Women Leaderships Forum, and this group decided to wanted to measure what was happening in our field. So one of the first things that we set out to do was do a survey. And in this survey, we tried to evaluate which career barriers were the barriers that people were running into. So what was our audience? What were they experiencing? So this was one of the first things we set out. And another thing that we wanted to measure was how much harassment were these people suffering from. Because we know that harassment in the workplace, unfortunately, is still a very important topic. And at the same time, for a very long time, it has not received a lot of attention. So this was something we wanted to take along while we went looking for the barriers. So this is what we wanted to do at the first. So we wanted to measure the problem so that we can then try to find solutions to the problem. And when we talk about those barriers, we looked at different kinds of barriers. The barriers that we evaluated were age. We looked at gender. We looked at country of origin. And what we also evaluated was whether ethnicity influenced the type of barriers that people run into. And one of the interesting findings that we found that fortunately, most of the people that took our survey did not experience barriers, but when they did, more frequently women experienced these barriers. So gender was one of the most important barriers that was indicated, but we also saw that the other barriers more frequently occurred in women. So this is something that's very important. And this is especially important because we know that there's a leaky pipeline, which is also an example that's often used, in which along the way we lose women along the academic path, but also in the research path, they disappear. And we think this is because they run into these types of barriers. And we wanted to evaluate which ones were important and in which fields. So, for instance, we looked at professional recognition, we looked at salary, and all types of areas. And in all these areas, gender is a very important barrier. Another important finding that we found is that when you look at participation in scientific societies, especially international societies, that country of origin was a very important barrier. So that's something that as societies we can strive to evaluate and to cure. So that's something that we should also take into consideration. So this is a bit what we found. But another interesting point, which is especially interesting when you start looking at solutions to this problem, is that across the globe, because we did a global survey, the results are not the same. So depending on where you're from, you might be running into different barriers. So this is something to take in consideration when you start looking for possible solutions. So a little bit more about the harassment issues, because as I mentioned, this is quite a big problem. And I think one of the most important things to realize is that we need to take ownership of this problem. And we need to realize that it's a problem for everyone and not just for the people who are being harassed. So this is really something that they cannot solve themselves. This is something that we need to solve together. And this is quite a complex issue. I would very much invite all people listening to read our papers on this issue, because in those we do a lot of recommendations on how to combat these issues. But one of the important things to realize is that there's already a very big barrier to reporting when there is harassment. And once this is reported, often the policies are very unclear. So then even though people have gotten over the barrier of reporting, then they are still being held back. And we know that they need help in this. So these policies need to be clear, they need to be transparent, and they need to be held accountable. So institutions, for instance, themselves, they need to report what their numbers are. They need to report how they dealt with the complaints and what is being done. And finally, I would like to put out the message that it's very important for bystanders who are witnessing these types of behaviors to recognize it, but also to act accordingly. Because we know that often people stay quiet and they don't do anything. And if they don't have any training, this is, of course, somewhat understandable. But once they do something, that can really help those that experience harassment. So as a bystander, there's a very important role for being able to correct the behavior that's going on.